In November 1986, in a quiet Polish prison surrounded by pine forests, a 90-year-old man died in his cell, and almost nobody in the world noticed. But here is what makes this death one of the strangest stories of the 20th century. This man had been sentenced to death 27 years earlier, and the sentence was never carried out. This man had once ruled over 17 million people with absolute power, had sent more than 1 million of them into slavery, and was responsible for some of the darkest chapters of the Second World War. Nuremberg hanged men who had done far less. The Soviets executed men who had done far less. And yet this man, one of the most brutal Nazi governors who ever lived, was fed, guarded, given newspapers and medical care, and kept alive decade after decade after decade. Why? Because he claimed to know the location of a treasure that had been called the eighth wonder of the world, a treasure worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a treasure that vanished in 1945 and has never been found to this day. His name was Erich Koch, and this is the story of how the knowledge inside one man's head may have been the only thing standing between him and the gallows. Now, to understand how strange this story really is, you need to understand who Erich Koch was, because he was not some minor official who signed papers in a back office. Adolf Hitler personally gave him 2 of the largest territories the Third Reich ever controlled, and Koch ran them with a cruelty that shocked even other Nazis, which is a sentence you don't get to say very often. His own colleagues wrote complaints about him. His nominal boss tried for years to have him removed. And when everything collapsed in 1945, Koch did something that tells you everything about his character, something we will get to, because it involves an icebreaker, thousands of abandoned refugees, and one of the greatest disappearing acts in history. He then spent 4 years hiding under a false name, working as a farm laborer, before being caught in a way that was almost embarrassing. And then came the trial, the death sentence, and the 27 years of silence, during which Soviet officials quietly traveled to a Polish prison again and again to sit across a table from a convicted war criminal and ask him one question: "Where is the amber room? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will understand why some secrets are worth more than justice itself." Erich Koch was born on June 19, 1896, in Elberfeld, an industrial town in western Germany that is today part of the city of Wuppertal. His background could not have been more ordinary. His father was a factory foreman. The family had little money, and young Erich trained for a modest career and eventually found work as a railway clerk, stamping tickets and filing paperwork. Nothing about him suggested that this short, stocky man with a small mustache would one day hold the power of life and death over millions of human beings. When the First World War broke out, Koch went into the army like millions of other young Germans, served as a soldier, and came home in 1918 to a country in chaos. Germany had lost the war. The economy was collapsing. Revolutionaries were fighting in the streets, and an entire generation of angry young veterans was looking for someone to blame. Koch drifted into the Freikorps, the violent paramilitary groups made up of former soldiers who fought against communists and against the new borders in the East. And this is where his worldview hardened into something dark. And then, in 1922, he made the decision that would define his entire life. He joined a small, loud, radical party based in Munich, a party that at the time most Germans considered a fringe movement of cranks and street brawlers. It was the Nazi Party, and Koch joined it so early that his membership number was in the double digits. Think about that for a second. Millions of Germans would eventually join that party, but Erich Koch was there almost from the very beginning, before Hitler was famous, before the beer hall putsch, before anyone believed these people could ever take power. In the strange internal logic of the Nazi movement, that early loyalty was worth more than gold, because Hitler never forgot the men who had believed in him when nobody else did. And that loyalty paid off spectacularly. Koch worked his way up through the party organization in the Ruhr region, got himself fired from the railway for his political activities, which only raised his standing among the radicals, and in 1928, he received a reward that changed everything. Hitler appointed him Gauleiter of East Prussia, which means regional party leader, the top Nazi in the entire province. Now, East Prussia was a special place. It was the easternmost part of Germany, a land of lakes and forests and old Teutonic castles, cut off from the rest of the country by Polish territory, with the ancient city of Königsberg as its capital. Remember that name, Königsberg, because it sits at the very heart of this story, and we will come back to it. When Hitler took power in 1933, Koch added the title of Oberpräsident, the top government official of the province, which meant he now controlled both the party and the state in East Prussia. He answered to almost no one except Hitler himself, and he ran the province like a personal kingdom. People actually called him the Little Tsar of East Prussia, and he earned the nickname. He set up something called the Erich Koch Foundation, which sounds charitable until you learn what it actually did, which was to take over businesses. New One tried to move against him. They ran into the same wall. Hitler protected him. The old fighter from 1922 was untouchable. And then came 1941, and with it, the moment that would turn Erich Koch from a corrupt provincial boss into one of the most consequential and most terrible figures of the entire war. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and as the German armies rolled east, Hitler had to decide who would govern the enormous territories being conquered. For Ukraine, the richest prize of all, the breadbasket of Europe, a land of fertile black soil and tens of millions of people, he chose Erich Koch, appointing him Reichskommissar of Ukraine in September 1941. And here is where the story takes a turn that even people inside the Nazi regime found shocking. Because there were actually two competing visions for how to run Ukraine. Alfred Rosenberg, the minister officially responsible for the occupied eastern territories and technically Koch's superior, argued that Germany should treat the Ukrainians as potential allies. Millions of them had suffered horribly under Stalin. The man-made famine of the 1930s had killed enormous numbers of people, and when the Germans first arrived, there were villages where locals genuinely hoped the newcomers might be better than what they had endured. Rosenberg wanted to use that, keep the schools open, allow some self-government, win the population over, and turn Ukraine into a partner against Moscow. It was a cold and calculated strategy, but it was a strategy. Erich Koch's vision was different, and he never hid it. He stood up at a meeting in Rivne, the small city he chose as his capital, and told his own officials, and I am quoting his actual words here, that he had not come to Ukraine to spread happiness, that the population must work, work, and work again, and that Germany was a master race whose lowliest worker was worth 1,000 times more than the people of this land. At another gathering, in Kiev, in March 1943, he said something that has gone down in history as perhaps the purest expression of his worldview. He said that if he ever found a Ukrainian worthy of sitting at the same table with him, he would have to have that man shot. That was the governor Hitler chose for 17 million people. And when Rosenberg protested, when he wrote memos and demanded meetings and tried again and again to rein Koch in, Hitler listened to both men and sided with Koch every single time. The little Tsar of East Prussia was now also the absolute master of Ukraine, and no one on earth except Hitler himself could tell him no. What followed was one of the most brutal occupation regimes in modern history, and I will spare you the most graphic details, because this is a story you should be able to watch with your family, but you need to understand the scale of what happened under this man's rule, because it explains everything that comes later. Koch treated Ukraine as one giant resource to be squeezed dry. Grain, coal, metal, and above all, people. Under his administration, the occupation authorities rounded up young men and women, sometimes entire villages at a time, and shipped them west in freight cars to work in German factories and on German farms. They were called Ostarbeiter, Eastern workers, and from Koch's territory alone, historians estimate that well over 1 million people were deported into forced labor, more than from any other occupied region. Families were torn apart at train stations. Villages that resisted were burned. Schools beyond the 4th grade were closed because, in Koch's own stated view, the local population needed to know only enough to read road signs and follow orders. Food was requisitioned so ruthlessly that cities starved while trains full of Ukrainian grain rolled toward Germany. And running parallel to all of this, in the same territory and during the same years, the machinery of the Holocaust did its terrible work, and hundreds of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in the ravines and forests of the land Koch governed. He did not pull triggers himself. He didn't need to. He created the kingdom in which all of it happened. He set its tone from the very first speech, and he never once used his enormous power to slow any of it down. Even Alfred Rosenberg, a man who would himself be hanged at Nuremberg, wrote furious complaints that Koch's methods were driving the entire population into the arms of the partisans. And Rosenberg was right about that, because by 1943, Ukraine was burning with resistance, and every convoy, every railway line, every garrison in Koch's kingdom was under attack. The man who said the population must work, work, and work again had instead created millions of people with absolutely nothing left to lose. But here is a detail about Koch that most people miss, and it matters enormously for what comes next. For most of the war, Koch didn't actually live in Ukraine. He hated the place. He ran it through deputies and flying visits while spending most of his time back home in Königsberg, in East Prussia, where he remained Gauleiter the entire time, holding both jobs at once. He sat in Königsberg like a spider at the center of a web, and Königsberg in those years was filling up with something very particular. Because as German armies looted their way across the occupied Soviet Union, an enormous stream of stolen art and cultural treasures flowed westward, and a great deal of it flowed directly into Koch's capital. Paintings, icons, church bells, entire museum collections. And in the autumn of 1941, German soldiers entered the Catherine Palace near Leningrad, in the town of Pushkin, and found something extraordinary. An entire room whose walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in carved and polished amber, backed with gold leaf and mirrors, glowing like honey and fire. The Amber Room. It had been created in the early 1700s, given by the King of Prussia to Peter the Great of Russia, and expanded over the centuries into what people genuinely called the eighth wonder of the world, roughly 6 tons of amber, a material so precious it was once worth more than gold. The Soviet curators had tried to hide it by papering over the walls, but the deception failed. German teams dismantled the entire room in a matter of days, packed the panels into crates, and shipped them west. And where did the eighth wonder of the world end up? In Königsberg, in the old Teutonic castle in the middle of the city, in the personal domain of Gauleiter Erich Koch, where the panels were partially reassembled and put on display, and where Koch, the master of the province, treated the whole collection of looted treasures as one more jewel in his private empire. Hold that thought, because in 1945, the Amber Room was in Königsberg Castle, and then it was gone, and no one has seen it since. Now the war turns, and it turns hard. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army had thrown the Germans out of Ukraine entirely, and Koch's eastern kingdom evaporated, leaving him with just his original one, East Prussia, which now found itself directly in the path of the largest army the world had ever seen. And this is where Erich Koch's story stops being about cruelty at a distance and becomes about cruelty you can see with your own eyes. Because as the Soviet forces approached the borders of East Prussia in late 1944, the civilian population, hundreds of thousands of ordinary German families, women, children, elderly people, wanted only one thing: to get out, to flee west before the front reached them. And Koch, as Gauleiter, had the authority over civilian evacuation. He refused. He declared that evacuation was defeatism, that anyone leaving without permission was a coward and a traitor, that East Prussia would be held, and he kept the roads and the trains restricted while the front crept closer and closer. Only when the Soviet offensive of January 1945 smashed through the German lines did the dam break, and by then it was catastrophically late. What followed was one of the most terrible civilian tragedies of the entire war. Enormous columns of refugees fled on foot through one of the coldest winters in memory, in temperatures far below freezing, with Soviet tanks sometimes cutting the roads ahead of them. Tens of thousands died in the snow. On the ice of the frozen lagoon, they tried to cross to reach the coast, and at sea, where overloaded evacuation ships were sunk, including the Wilhelm Gustloff, which went down with an estimated 9,000 people aboard, most of them refugees, the deadliest sinking of a single ship in human history. All of it made incomparably worse because one man had forbidden them to leave when there was still time. And what did that man do himself? In late January 1945, while calling on the population to fight to the last, Erich Koch quietly relocated from Königsberg to the Baltic coast, keeping himself carefully away from the fighting. Königsberg was surrounded, endured a horrific siege, and finally fell in April. And in those final days, as the last desperate refugees fought for space on any vessel that could float, Koch boarded the icebreaker Ostpreußen, a ship at his personal disposal, and sailed away to safety across the Baltic, abandoning the province he had ruled for 17 years and the people he had forbidden to flee. The little Tsar left his kingdom to burn behind him. And somewhere in that burning city, in the cellars of a castle now shattered by bombs and fire, the crates of the amber room either burned or were buried or had already been moved to a hiding place known to only a handful of men, one of whom was now steaming west across the Baltic Sea. And now Erich Koch pulls off his vanishing act. In the chaos of collapsing Germany, one of the most wanted men in Europe simply dissolved. He obtained papers in the name of Rolf Berger, presented himself as a discharged army veteran, a nobody, and settled in the countryside near Hamburg in the British occupation zone, where he worked as a farm laborer. Think about the picture for a moment. The man who had ruled 17 million people, who had lived in castles and hunted on private estates, was now milking cows and digging potatoes for a farmer who had no idea who he was. And he kept it up not for months, but for years. While the Nuremberg trials hanged his colleagues, while Rosenberg, the boss he had humiliated for years, went to the gallows in 1946, Rolf Berger kept his head down and survived. The Poles wanted him. The Soviets wanted him. His name was on the lists of major war criminals. And he was invisible. It lasted 4 years, and it ended, as these stories so often do, not through some brilliant detective work, but through recognition. In May 1949, he was identified and arrested by the British authorities near Hamburg. The farm laborer Rolf Berger was fingerprinted, and the fingerprints belonged to Erich Koch. And now came a question with enormous consequences. 2 countries demanded his extradition. The Soviet Union, on whose territory in Ukraine his greatest crimes had been committed, and Poland, because East Prussia's southern half was now Polish territory, and Koch had been involved in crimes against Poles going back to 1939. The British handed him to Poland in 1950. Not to the Soviet Union, to Poland. Remember that detail, because some people believe it is the reason this story has the ending it has. And then, silence. Koch sat in Polish custody for 8 years before he was ever brought to trial, and historians have argued ever since about why it took so long. The official explanation spoke of gathering evidence and of Koch's health. But 8 years is a very long time, and during those years, something interesting was happening behind closed doors, which we will get to. The trial finally opened in Warsaw in October 1958, and it was a strange trial in one crucial respect. Koch was tried only for crimes committed against Poles on territory that was now Poland, mainly from his role in the destruction and terror in the Polish districts attached to his domain. His crimes in Ukraine, the deportation of more than 1 million people, the starvation, the complicity in mass murder on an almost unimaginable scale were not on the charge sheet, because legally they had been committed on Soviet territory, and he was standing before a Polish court. Koch's defense was, frankly, absurd. He claimed he had secretly opposed the worst policies, that he had been a friend of the Slavic peoples, that others had done the killing behind his back. The court didn't believe a word of it, and on March 9th, 1959, Erich Koch was sentenced to death by hanging. And here, right here, is where this story becomes unlike any other story I have told on this channel, because the sentence was never carried out. Not that year, not the next year, not in the 1960s, not in the 1970s, not ever. The official reason given was Koch's poor health, and yes, he was in his 60s and claimed a long list of ailments. But gravely ill men in his condition do not usually go on to live another 27 years, and Erich Koch did exactly that. A man too sick to hang in 1959 was still alive, still eating his meals, still reading his newspapers, in 1970, in 1980, in 1986. Poland in those years was not a country famous for showing mercy to convicted Nazi war criminals. So, why was this one of the very worst of them all, allowed to grow old? The answer, according to a great many historians, journalists, and former officials who have looked into this case, glowed like honey and fire and weighed 6 tons. The Amber Room. Because think about who Erich Koch was in 1945. He was the Gauleiter of Königsberg, the absolute master of the city where the Amber Room was last seen with certainty. Nothing of significance moved in that province without his knowledge. If the crates were evacuated, he would have known where. If they were hidden in bunkers or tunnels or sunken barges, he would have known where. If they burned in the castle fire, he would have known that too. And the Soviet Union wanted the Amber Room back with an intensity that is hard to overstate. This was not just an artwork, it was a national wound, a masterpiece torn out of a Russian palace, and its recovery was a matter of state prestige at the highest level. Soviet search expeditions dug through the ruins of Königsberg, which was now the Soviet city of Kaliningrad, for decades. They excavated the castle cellars. They explored old forts and tunnels. They followed thousands of leads, and they found nothing. And all that time, sitting in a cell in the Polish prison of Barczewo, in a quiet town among the lakes and forests of what had once been his own province, was the one man who might actually know. And so the visitors came. Over the years, Soviet representatives traveled to that prison to talk with Erich Koch, and Polish officials questioned him as well, and Koch, who had spent his whole life playing power games, understood exactly what cards he was holding. He talked. Oh, he talked, but he never quite said anything. He dropped hints. He suggested the panels had been hidden and could perhaps be recovered. In an interview in the 1960s, he indicated the crates had been walled up in a bunker beneath Königsberg, then muddied the waters again. He implied that only he could identify the spot, and that he could hardly do so from a prison cell, could he? Every hint bought him time. Every vague suggestion made his execution unthinkable, because you cannot hang the map. Whether there was ever anything real behind the hints, whether Koch truly knew the secret, or was simply running the longest and most cynical bluff in criminal history, trading a treasure he did not have for year after year of life, is a question nobody has ever been able to answer. What we know is this: the man sentenced to death in March 1959 was still alive when Brezhnev came to power, still alive when men walked on the moon, still alive when Poland exploded with the solidarity strikes, still alive, the last surviving major territorial ruler of Hitler's empire, sitting in his cell in Barczewo, by then a very old man in glasses, described by those who saw him as arrogant to the end, unrepentant to the end, and silent on the only subject that mattered to the end. Erich Koch died in Barczewo prison on November 12, 1986, at the age of 90. He outlived Hitler by 41 years. He outlived almost everyone he had served with, everyone who had been hanged at Nuremberg, everyone who had died in the war he helped bring to millions of innocent people, and whatever he knew or did not know about the eighth wonder of the world, he took with him. The Amber Room has never been found. In the decades since, searchers have dug in mines, drained lakes, explored bunkers across Germany, Poland, and Kaliningrad, and chased 100 theories. And every few years a new expedition makes headlines and comes home with empty hands. In the 1990s, a few genuine fragments surfaced, a single mosaic panel and a chest of drawers from the room found in Germany, which proved that at least some pieces had been separated from the main crates before the end. But the room itself, the 6 tons of glowing amber, remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries on Earth. Russia eventually built a complete replica, which you can visit today in the Catherine Palace. 24 years of painstaking work by modern craftsmen, beautiful and haunting, a copy standing in for an original that vanished into the fire and snow of 1945. And when you look at this whole story from a distance, there is something almost unbearable about how it ends. Erich Koch was responsible for suffering on a scale that most of us cannot truly imagine. More than 1 million people deported into slavery, untold numbers starved, burned out of their homes, murdered under his rule, tens of thousands of his own people frozen and drowned because he forbade them to flee, while he kept an icebreaker waiting for himself. Justice, real justice, would have been swift and certain. Instead, he received 27 extra years of life, not because anyone doubted his guilt, and not because anyone showed him mercy, but because 2 governments could not bring themselves to destroy the one head that might contain the location of a treasure. He almost certainly understood that himself, and he used it hint by hint, year by year, playing his very last game of power from inside a prison cell and in his own dark way, winning it. The man who once said he would shoot any Ukrainian worthy of sitting at his table died in a warm bed, of old age, guarded and cared for until his final breath. And somewhere out there, in a forgotten bunker, at the bottom of a lagoon, or long since turned to ash beneath a Soviet city, lies the answer he never gave. If this story got under your skin, the way it got under mine, let me know in the comments which lost treasure or which forgotten figure of that war you want me to dig into next, and I will see you in the next one.